In ihrem Vortrag wird Noortje das Konzept des amerikanischen Philosophen John Dewey, dessen Konzept von Öffentlichkeit, in das Zentrum stellen. Dewey hat argumentiert, dass die Bildung von Öffentlichkeiten mit dem Auftreten eines Problems beginnt. Nach seiner Ansicht entstehen Öffentlichkeiten in der Folge aktueller Ereignisse. Sie kommen dann zustande, wenn sich Fremde plötzlich gemeinsam vor dasselbe Problem gestellt sehen. Also im Kurzschluss kein Problem, keine Öffentlichkeit. Noortje Marres wird die Konzeption von Dewey auf eine Art und Weise diskutieren, wie dieses Konzept zum Verständnis der Anforderungen beitragen kann, denen sich Theorie und Praxis der Öffentlichkeit heute gegenüberstehen. Kurz einige Bemerkungen zu unserer bemerkenswerten Referentin. Noortje Marres hat an der Universität in Amsterdam und an der École des Mines in Paris Soziologie und Philosophie studiert. Zurzeit ist sie Dozentin für Soziologie an der Goldsmiths University of London, wo sie auch das Center for Study of Invention and Social Process leitet. Im Mittelpunkt ihres Forschungsinteresses stehen die Beziehungen zwischen Technologie, Demokratie und Umwelt, die mit verschiedenen Forschungsansätzen ausgelotet werden. Und es hat mich sehr beeindruckt, als ich in ihrer Biografie gelesen habe, dass unter der Auflistung ihrer Forschungsinteressen Felder wie Soziologie, Pragmatismus, digitale Soziologie, Umweltstudien, um nur einige zu nennen, stehen. Und diese Liste wird abgeschlossen mit der Anmerkung and 33 more. Das finde ich äußerst bemerkenswert und ich hoffe, wir werden heute Abend auch einige von diesen 33 Interessenfeldern auch berührt sehen. Und ich darf Sie jetzt bitten, mit mir herzlich Noortje Marres zu begrüßen. Vielen Dank.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here. I just had a walk in the beautiful park outside that I didn't even know was here. And now to discuss a very important theme and a theme dear to my heart. I was looking for a starting point for this talk, and I found it in the enumeration of crises that we have been experiencing over the last years. The banking crisis, climate change, the Arab revolutions, the privatization of the universities, so many crises. And one of the consequences of them, I think, is that public affairs have gained in relevance and urgency. After so many crises, the importance of public problems appears to be much more firmly established than it was before. To use the politicians' language, today we seem to be in this together much more than before. However, it is not only the relevance or the importance of public affairs that has grown in recent years. Another thing that has increased, I think, is the scale of our public affairs. So in the 1990s and even in the 2000s, it was still possible to imagine that myopia would take over our public cultures. What was prominent then was a criticism of NIMBYism, the fear that people would only care about issues in their own backyard. It was said that people only cared about pet issues now, today. Problems occurring in their immediate environments and which were marked by triviality, a fence in the wrong place, a noisy train riding too late into the night. By comparison, it can seem that today the big issues are back. We are concerned with the stability of our economic systems. We are concerned with inequality, the climate system. All this is clearly and more undisputably at stake. Now, in several respects and for several reasons, we can welcome this scaling up of public affairs. We can say that it brings a necessary expansion of the frame on political issues, a reawakening of public awareness to what preconditions our existence, to the issues that really matter. But I think that there are also risks and dangers associated with the return to big issues. As public affairs are restored to their proper scale, we may also be returning to much more traditional forms of public culture. Today, public problems seem to be increasingly defined in totalizing terms, as when the whole of society is summed up in the problem of inequality, or when the whole of the environment is summed up in the problem of the Anthropocene, the idea that we have entered an age of a man-made Earth system. Such big problems have serious limitations, and one of their limitations is that the formulation of such big problems depends on highly specialized architectures of politics and knowledge. So one way to put this in simple terms is to say that big problems require big stages, and they require, most of all perhaps, the contrast with small problems. And as such, they bring with them the risk that we're returning to an all too familiar asymmetrical organization of the public. So on the one hand, there would be those who are equipped to understand big problems and to act upon big problems, while on the other hand, there would be those absorbed by small issues. Paradoxically then, while public problems are being restored to their proper importance and urgency, the space of public participation may actually be shrinking, the scope of public life reduced. And this is the problem that, in my view, requires attention, and that is the main focus of my lecture today. And this is because I believe very strongly that there are other ways to formulate public affairs, rather than a vertical ascent to the bigger scale, as when the whole of society or the environment is summed up in one problem. Current affairs may also happen by unfolding horizontally. Issues can circulate in more lateral, more open-ended manners among a variety of locations that don't necessarily add up to a totalizing whole. However, this other way for public issues to take shape can easily seem less than public. It can easily seem to fall short when they are measured against total problems. So the issues that happen laterally can seem not quite up to the task of that we expect public affairs to perform. Now, to clarify this other type of public affair, how I understand it and what forms they might take, I want to first turn to political theory and discuss a particular concept of public affairs that developed by the pragmatist John Dewey, as you mentioned. But after that, I want to step away from theory, and I would like to discuss a number of recent projects that were developed at the intersection of art and research and also politics, and which in my view exemplify especially well how these other type of public affairs may come about or indeed can be made. So, no issue, no public. What brings a public into being? Political theorists have answered that question in very different ways. Some have argued that what is required for a public to take shape is a distinct form of sociability. What is required is that people are able to engage with strangers, as can happen in cities or in cafe culture or in public transport. But others have insisted not so much on the importance of sociability among actors, but on ideas, on the deployment of symbols, of language, and indeed ideals in the framing of public problems. According to the second view, what is of critical importance for publics to form are interpretive repertoires, because such interpretive repertoires make it possible to establish the general importance of specific occurrences. So it's only when, say, a factory accident is connected with a bigger issue, say that of pollution, and with a bigger idea, say that of worker safety or worker rights, that only then does this affair assume the importance of a public affair. Now, I would like to step away from both these answers to the question of what makes a public affair and focus on a third answer. And this is the answer given by the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, who argued and insisted that something else needs to be in place above and beyond the two elements I just mentioned. There has to be a problem. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Dewey and his interlocutor, the journalist Walter Lippmann, proposed that the formation of publics starts with the happening of an issue. In their view, publics arise in the wake of current affairs. According to the often cited definition that Dewey offered in his book, The Public and Its Problems, the public comes about when people are harmfully affected by indirect consequences of action. So, when a railroad gets built or a factory closes, a wide range of people experience the implications of such an event. Not just the people who are directly involved, say the workers, but also commuters, farmers, and so on. But even as a variety of strangers come to be jointly implicated in such a situation, these actors are at the same time rendered incapable of shared action on this problem. So in giving this example of a public affair, I'm drawing on an example given by the other pragmatist Walter Lippmann, who spoke of the publics called into being by a railroad strike, or the implementation of an agricultural tariff. Now, as Walter Lippmann made clear in this quote, people or persons are implicated in issues in highly divergent ways, as workers, as mothers, as farmers, as commuters, and so on and so on. The interest of each of these persons is different, and they are often diametrically opposed. And this is the crucial bit of a public coming into being for the pragmatists. Because for them, a public comes about when strangers, actors who do not share a social context, commuters, farmers, workers, mothers, when such strangers find themselves jointly but antagonistically implicated in a problem, a strike, a tariff. Public life, from this perspective, is not just about ideas, and it's not just about people socializing, it is about issues. And as was already mentioned, we could say, then, no issue, no public. Now, there are two things about this slogan that I want to flag here, and I think are especially important in relation to the broader question of that I raised in the introduction. Now, the first is that this idea of no issue, no public was developed by the pragmatists in the 1920s because they thought that democratic theory needed an update. It needed to be updated in order to make it fit with the technological, globalizing societies of their age. So Lippmann and Dewey explain, and they emphasize, that transformations of society, like industrialization, mass migration, the rise of the media in the 1920s, that these transformations change society to a point that classic ideals of democracy formulated in previous centuries, that these are no longer adequate. And what especially required adjustment in their view was the ideal of simplicity assumed in classic theories of democracy. They take issue with a particular ideal formulated by an American founding father of democracy, Thomas Jefferson, which is the ideal of the New England village. The notion that democracy requires a small, contained community of which the members are intimately familiar with its affairs, where all members have good knowledge of the issues at stake in that community. The problem with this ideal, the pragmatist argues, is that it leaves no space for what they called foreign entanglements. But the condition for democracy has radically altered in modern societies to the point that it precisely makes no sense anymore to exclude or to try to exclude complexity from democracy. Because in these societies, complex problems is what democracy is for. Public participation is necessary in order to address precisely complex issues. Furthermore, issues that are marked by complexity, issues that no one understands and about which no one knows what to do, these are the issues that provide the most important occasion for publics to participate in politics and to get involved. So complexity cannot be seen as a threat to democracy anymore. It is its most important occasion. Now, in saying this, the pragmatists also made another move. They foregrounded the importance of material events to public life. So the examples that they gave of complex problems were things like floods, the risk of earthquakes increasing, the destruction of housing to make way for new developments, toxic air, pollution. These are, in the pragmatist writings, the formative moments and the type of complex situation that require publics to assemble. And it's very important, I think, that for them, the importance of such material events does not derive from cynical reasons. So it's not just because natural disasters and the destruction of neighborhoods, that these things are spectacular enough to draw the attention of the media. Like, this is not their reasoning. It's not because disasters are sensational enough to capture our attention. For the pragmatists, material disturbances matter to public life because they disrupt ingrained ways of doing things. They put our habits and our habitats at stake, and because of this, they rob our habits and our habitats from their self-evidence. That is, they open up our ways of living for questioning. Now, this approach draws on a wider philosophical commitment that runs through the whole of John Dewey's work. And this is the commitment of Dewey that to a proposal that's in some ways strange, namely his proposal that we need to learn how to think politics and we need to learn how to think morality as something and as phenomena that unfold on the plane of things. So in his view, things like values, desires, interests, these political and moral phenomena are best regarded as aspects of objective situations. As Dewey put it, such things as lack and need, things like conflict and clash, desire and effort, loss and satisfaction, these things must be referred to objective reality. So for the pragmatist, morality and politics, and also publics, are processes that, at least in part, unfold on the plane of material happenings. Now, pragmatism has generally had a very good reception in social and political theory, but this particular point, that politics and morality are phenomena that unfold on the plane of objects, this point has until recently not at all been taken on board, especially in political theory. So in the post-war period, public affairs have largely been understood in discursive terms. Issue formation has been defined as principally a matter of the deployment of salient ideas, of issue frames, of interpretations, and not material events. Insofar as material events received appreciation as forces of problematization, and there's one exception that I wanted to mention here, and this is the work of Ulrich Beck, who took the nuclear accident of Chernobyl as the starting point for the whole of his social theory. But most theories, other than Ulrich Beck, tend to accord to material events only significance insofar as they present preconditions for public life. And once that precondition of a material event like a flood is in place, the next step in the cycle of public life is to return to the familiar grounds of discourse, of framing and interpreting the world with the aid of ideas and values. Because of this, the question, even though the pragmatists developed their work in the 1920s, the question is still very much on the table. If public issue formation begins with material events, how can it make a difference? How do material events make a difference to the conduct and the formation of public affairs? Now, the pragmatist definition of a public affair, and here we move into a second part of my talk. The definition, the pragmatist definition of a public affair that I just described or presented mostly tells us about what a public affair is. What are the formative features of a public problem? But what I presented so far does not really tell us very much about the means by which a public affair comes about, or the means by which a public affair is made. But of course, the arising of the issue, the happening of the problem, can only be half the story. The other half must address the need for intervention. And to indulge in one last quote of John Dewey, in other work, he made it clear that when a problematic situation arises, when an issue happens, so when there is trouble happening, what immediately also becomes clear is that this trouble needs to be done away with. The conflict needs to be resolved. And he says this needs to be done by changing existing conditions. Now, this formulation, to change existing conditions, invokes experimentation. And this is the particular mode of intervention, that of the experimentation, that I want to turn to now to answer the question, what makes a public affair? Now, to be sure, there's already something experimental about the slogan, no issue, no public. When an issue arises, I said, ingrained ways of doing things are disturbed in multiple and contradictory ways. And this disturbance of ingrained ways of doing things is what sparks a public into being. An issue arising then already involves, in and of itself, the making of trouble, the happening of a trouble, already involves a change in existing conditions. But while this signals that events have experimental consequences, they force us to experiment, experimentalism is, of course, first and foremost a method. Now, this analytic value of the disturbance of habits and ingrained ways of doing things is widely recognized across the arts, across social and political movements, and across social science. And I will focus on the latter of these, social science, because this is for me the most familiar terrain. And here, sociologists have, from the 1960s onwards, recognized that experimental intervention is absolutely critical to knowing the world and to knowing the social world, and also, I want to argue, to knowing public affairs. So Harold Garfinkel, the sociologist, argued that if we are to know the social world, if we are to understand what social order and social disorder consists of, the only way to gain such knowledge is by disturbing, by experimentally intervening in social practices and social life. He demonstrated this point through various ludic experiments, for instance, by inviting his students to stand too close to strangers during superficial conversations in public places. Or he would ask them to treat their housemates as strangers during breakfast. making such experimental interventions in everyday life, he showed that when social actors' expectations are challenged, when their expectations about our habitual ways of doing things in this world are challenged, they will be provoked, these actors will be provoked into providing accounts of the social situation. They will make the social world legible by starting to describe it. And yeah, that means that they will explicate the situation, in this case, for the social scientists who wants to know what goes on in social life. But as I noted, this kind of an experimental method in which one provokes or disturbs ways of doing things in order to provoke a situation where the situation is rendered legible, this kind of intervention is not exclusive to social science at all. It has equally been taken up by the civil disobedience movements and in the performative arts. Now, in a famous example that sits somewhere between the arts and civil disobedience, the Dutch novelist Jan Wolkers released a number of chickens on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam in the 1970s. And this, at that particular occasion, brought out the police in very large numbers. And the royal wedding was to take place a few weeks after this release of chickens on the canal, which may be a relevant context. But in producing this effect, the intervention of Jan Wolkers produced a very adequate demonstration of a point that the left had been trying to make for some times in the Netherlands at the time, which was the point that the Netherlands and its capital Amsterdam in particular was being run like a police state. So a minor intervention, 3-4 chickens on the canal, when well timed and well placed, can help to demonstrate wider problematics, problems that are operative on another scale. Now, another example of this, to me, very important effect and important mode of intervention, can be found in a work of environmental art by the German-British collective Hey Hey, who produced a work called Nuage about 6 or 7 years ago. This work made the minor intervention of projecting a green laser cloud onto the smokestack of a power plant in an urban environment. And they did this first in Helsinki in 2008 and then in Paris in 2009. Now, both these events, in Helsinki and then in Paris, generated innumerable accounts in the media, old and new, and including in the French case in the national daily Libération. Now, the accounts of Nuage Vert, the art project, in the news featured not only the images of the green cloud. They featured the images of the lit up smokestack, but they also included abundant descriptions of the environments into which the green cloud was inserted, as in the case of Saint-Ouen, the suburb of Paris, where Hey Hey staged its second Nuage Vert. And these media accounts mentioned, for instance, Sictum, the waste management company on the smokestack of which the green cloud was to be projected. And in their own publicity of this incineration plant, the cloud is missing. The press and blogs and other accounts also mentioned the local council, the prefecture of Saint-Denis, which formally, officially forbade Nuage Vert, officially banned it from taking place, on the grounds that the green cloud would cause worry and panic among the local population and road users. As such, this experimental intervention of Nuage Vert, the green cloud, did not just help, it did not just serve as an explication of the object onto which the green laser beam was projected, the smokestack or the cloud. Nuage Vert did not just render visible the features of that material environment, the power plant in the city, it also helped to explicate the issues and the controversies that were latent in those environments. So at the time that Hey produced the green cloud in Saint-Ouen, there were plans on the table to build an eco-town. And this eco-town would be very close to Siktam, the waste incineration plant. And the health risks associated with the waste incineration plant these health issues were one of the issues at stake in the political process of planning this eco-town. So Nuage Vert brought into focus an especially problematic element of this setting. By not giving formal permission for Nuage Vert to take place, the local council then did not exactly succeed in closing the controversy. To the contrary, as Nuage Vert itself became a focal point of controversy, because Nuage Vert was forbidden, it was prevented from happening officially, the smokestack became more and more visible in more places, in more media accounts, and in more spoof images circulating online. And in that regard, I think Nuage Vert is a particularly accomplished example of the kind of experimental intervention that I'm foregrounding here. And of course, there's much more to say about this project. But the point that I wanted to make here is that Nuage Vert, through a relatively small experimental intervention in the environment, namely the projection of a green cloud, it helped to explicate the issues and the controversies that were latent and implicit in that environment. So this artwork did not just provide a screen for the projection of ideas into the setting, even though the artists themselves compared the green cloud with a canvas, an empty canvas for the projection of fantasy. But I think it did not just, the project, or the cloud did not just facilitate the imposition of interpretations onto the environment, it helped to explicate and extract and amplify the controversies and the issues that were happening in that environment. So, at the risk of hyperbole, one could say that Nuage demonstrates to us an environmental way of making a public affair. By materially intervening in an everyday environment, the cloud helped to formulate and give form to a public affair. Now, what follows from this? I like to believe that the work of Hehe opens up an alternative understanding of experimental intervention and of how this contributes to public life. The idea that current issues can be acted upon through experimental intervention in everyday settings is today increasingly taken up. But it is mostly framed in very anti-democratic and anti-public terms, as in talk of behavior change and nudging people into good behaviors. In such approaches, the experimental modification of everyday habitats, for instance, by introducing smart energy devices which automatically switch off the lights when you're not home, or a thermostat that adjusts the room temperature to your daily rhythm, such devices and such interventions are most often framed in a language of anti-awareness. It is said that by intervening materially into people's living environments, it becomes possible to act directly on people's habits, and that it is no longer necessary, when making such experimental interventions, to appeal to people's awareness. We can now have social environmental change without publics having to form. In such approaches, then, material intervention is part of a technocratic repertoire, which wrongly suggests that once we displace morality and politics onto the plane of things, that we then don't need publics anymore. So this is why Nuage Vert is important, one of the reasons why it's important. It reminds us and shows us that experimental intervention, in fact, can make a public affair in the fullest sense. When a setting is modified by material means, it is not just habits that are acted upon. Rather, it can now become apparent that material environments resonate with a broad range of problems. The modification of the setting is not a way of bypassing awareness. It offers an alternative register of awareness raising. And so material intervention can then realize a crucial condition for public inquiry. It makes issues legible. It explicates controversies. So what makes a public affair? My second answer is material intervention. So I have one more part and a conclusion. I said it will be hard to read from your faces how we're doing, but I think we're probably doing okay. Yeah. So there is Nuage Vert being taken up in many different places and being seen, and the cloud being seen in many different places. So 3, the last answer to the question, what makes a public affair? The more unstable, the more public. I think that so far I've shown that we are able to counter the claim that is still very strong in political theory and democratic theory. We're able to counter the claim that public life is primarily about the deployment of ideas. But many of the most difficult questions are still on the table. Yes, the articulation of public affairs may proceed by material means, but the question is, how does a public get organized? To capture actors' interests, to mobilize actors, surely they must be equipped to participate and to act on the issue. I think we are here at our most difficult point, as understanding how actors are organized into a public, in my view, requires a postponement of clarity. So I think we should not rush to posit a capable actor, and we should not indulge in the heroism of the citizen too soon. Because once we adopt the perspective of issue formation, the qualities that make for an effective public, a capable public, are very different from the qualities that are associated with heroic citizens. So, for an issue to organize a public, I think it must first of all circulate. And I want to argue that to do this, circulate, a public affair must be able to accommodate a wide variety of agendas and a wide variety of interests and desires. And for an affair to be able to do this, it must become less and less determinate in its features. And an affair has to become more and more variable, more and more unstable in terms of the meanings and the associations that it can take on if it is to become more public. Public life is precisely So this idea that a public affair is an affair that is highly unstable and variable and fluctuating in its associations, this is in some ways, I think, a very counterintuitive argument to make, because it's very often said and thought that public life and participating in a public is about adopting a robust position, that it's a matter of forming a steadfast opinion, of not shifting in your position. So the unmovability of a position is what is classically associated with a good public actor or a good public intervention. And I think that if we want to take seriously the capacities of objects and material things to make public issues, it's not robustness that we must look for, but variability, instability as a quality. So one example that I've used in previous work to clarify this variability of public affairs is the environmental teapot. This mundane appliance has been put forward in the UK and elsewhere as a way to publicize green issues like the climate and renewable energy. Gadgets like the eco-friendly kettle have then acquired salience as devices for raising awareness about these environmental issues. In publicity campaigns of energy companies and geeky boys and local governments, these objects have been presented as a playful way of getting people involved in issues, complex issues of climate change, and also to get them to think about the environmental consequences of their everyday habits in terms of energy use and dirty oil and consequences of fossil fuels. Now, with this teapot and the teapot circulating in and as part of efforts to thematize environmental issues, the teapot has gained many different associations. And in a recent small study, we tried to capture this variability of associations that have been connected with the teapot or folded into teapots as part of this awareness-raising campaigns. And so we produced this data visualization which shows which words are associated with the teapot in different networks, sustainable innovation, energy companies, and green blogging. Now, by looking at the associations that the teapot has invoked in these online spaces or spheres, we get into focus a variety of associations, many of them seeming rather trivial. So there is Star Trek, there's EastEnders, there are rural affairs, there are veg boxes, but there are also thought bombs and fuel poverty and grid management. And as the Teapot circulates, I think a figure like this gives us a sense of how it becomes more variable, less determinate, and in some ways even less consistent or coherent as an issue formation. But I think that it's really critical that we don't respond too impatiently to this type of object variability, that we do not dismiss fluctuating associations as just trivial or perhaps mainstream, because they suggest a lack of robustness, of steadfastness, and thereby would indicate a failure to organize a public around a strong commitment or a focused demand. So I think what such figures, what a figure like this can help us, can remind us of, is that a public affair and public issues can also be made along the horizontal axis of circulation. And here, for a public affair or for an affair to become more public, what it needs, or what the accomplishment is of making an affair more public here, is that of a widening of the registers in which an affair is articulatable. So in a horizontal logic of circulation, which is very different from a vertical logic, where to make an affair public is to move up to a higher level of generality, where one can connect the issue with abstract values or abstract ideals. In such a horizontal and not a vertical way of forming issues, publicity does not involve an ascent to higher levels of generality. It does not involve a leaving behind of the particulars of the situation in order to grasp the matter at hand. I think that these affairs that form through circulation extend Dewey's idea that the public presents a particular distribution of affected actors and implicated things. It shows us, I think, a public as a lateral formation. And from such a lateral perspective, the multitude of associations that is folded into an affair does not indicate the failure to transcend the trivialities of our ways of living. The variability of the object precisely indicates that it is in the process of organizing a public. What makes a public affair? Third and last answer, object variability. So, to conclude, what makes a public affair? I've given three answers. First, a material event that disturbs established ways of doing things, in which strangers find themselves jointly implicated in a problematic state of affairs, but they find themselves implicated in divergent and indeed antagonistic ways. So they're not capable of shared action on the problem because they disagree. Which is also to say that my first answer was that when a public affair arises, that this is first of all an event, it's a happening, and as such, nothing makes a public affair. On this point, I think the theory of public affairs, political theory, social theory, has much to learn, not just from social science, but also from the arts. Robert Smithson the environmental artist who made the very famous land art piece Spiral Jeti, he wrote that the objective in making environmental art is to become part of the natural process. It is to become part of the process rather than overcoming natural processes. You just go along with it, and there can be a kind of building that can take place this way. We do not begin then with ideas to only then face the question of their materialization. Rather, we begin with material events and settings and then work with them in making public affairs. So my second answer was that public affairs can be made. They can be made by inserting new elements into the environment and by modifying settings in such a way that the issues that are latent in these settings are rendered explicit, so that the essential tension, the mutual exclusivities that mark the issue can be thematized. And thirdly, and finally, I pointed towards or gestured towards the circulation of affairs. And this matters, as I think was pretty clear, because it widens the range of environments in which the public affair can be articulated, in which it is articulatable beyond the limited settings of public culture. So, for the issue to become capable of organizing a public, for publics and not just a few actors to derive capacities for action. This is the thing you fear, right? The last page. But there it is. So, for the issue to become capable of organizing a public, for publics and not just a few actors to derive capacities for action from public affairs. For this to happen, the radius of the issue needs to expand. So, what difference does this make then? I said at the beginning that public life, in my view, is at risk of being recaptured by all too narrow logics of publicity. Logics in which the main objective becomes to define total public problems, to sum up the whole of society into the problem of inequality, to sum up the whole of the environment into the problem of the Anthropocene. I have sought to bring into focus a different way of organizing public affairs, one that does not work by scaling up problems, but by widening the range of settings from which public issues can be articulated. Part of this project, to be sure, is the old familiar project of the decentering of public life, of relocating public life to more marginal, seeming non-sites, and to demonstrate that in such unlikely locations, that in those locations too, public affairs can be enacted. But what is perhaps less self-evident is that such a decentering of public life does not automatically have to imply that we renounce public relevance, that we give up on the ambition to intervene in the centers of public life. Rather, it is to pursue a different logic of publicity, a different way of taking on the question of public relevance. And by way of a very last example, I would like to give a sense of why I think this is so, why we do not renounce public relevance when decamping to the kinds of sites that I focused on in my talk. It is the project Spiral Drawing Sunrise by the Dutch new media artists Esther Polak and Ivar van Beckum, who make sand drawings in many different locations, in urban squares, in rural places. And they make these sand drawings with the aid of a small robotic car that is powered by solar panels. And the car has a little battery in it, which means that it only starts driving when its battery is full when it has gathered enough sunlight, which makes that it jumps in such discontinuous steps. Nuage, spiral drawing sunrise is like an hourglass on wheels, with the bottle releasing sand as the car moves, powered by the sun. Here you see it in a public square in Amsterdam, where we used the device to capture a sunrise in the sand, with the cart moving very slowly in the morning when the light was still low, and more quickly later on. And as we waited for the sun to rise and the spiral to materialize, we also experienced the square at Frederiksplein. We experienced this square waking up. We noticed the daffodils, the dingle of the Amsterdam trams that have recently been replaced by German trams that are much less loud, so silent indeed that they are dangerous. There were the pigeons messing with the sand piles, women passing by with dogs, women passing by with bicycles, a guy flyering for a tattoo parlor, the employee of the Dutch National Bank, which is located on this square, who did not stop to watch, the editor of an Amsterdam liberal weekly magazine, who only stopped to watch very briefly. The men of the municipal cleaning service, who were there to sweep the streets and first drove circles around us in their cars and then sat down to watch from the benches. These then were the actors that this experimental intervention brought into focus. What makes a public affair? What makes a public affair on the Frederiksplein in Amsterdam? I think most of the elements are there in the list I just gave you. I think most of the elements that matter are there.